So, on behalf of the Harry Bridges Center for Labor Studies and the Labor Solidarity Project at the University of Washington, Tacoma, I'd like to welcome everyone back to our fall seminar series, Organizing for Change. My name is Alex Miller. I'm an associate teaching professor at UW-T, where I teach courses in labor studies, American studies, and literature. At the risk of understating or underselling things, a lot has changed since our last seminar meeting, which was 2 weeks ago. And I'd be lying if I told you tonight that I had a clear sense of where we're headed. We've definitely entered what I would describe generously as a time of uncertainty. And so I just want to acknowledge the fact that it's, reasonable to find yourself feeling a little confused, right? And that's a mutual feeling here. I think we're all looking for answers. We're looking for explanations individually, but also collectively as a nation. And I think it's, this is a process, right? And it's a process that's going to take some time. But part of this process, I think, involves coming to terms with the history that predates our recent history, right? And understanding, especially within the context of this class, just the role of class as a force that shapes political opinions and political movements. And understanding this is it's a dynamic process that's as much about sort of individual material conditions as it is about feelings, right? How we think about ourselves, how we think about others. There's a rich history there, and it is, it's instructive. Fortunately for us, our guest tonight is an absolute expert on this history. Stephen Greenhouse is a former labor and workplace correspondent at the New York Times, whose career spanned 5 administrations, I think from Reagan all the way up to Obama, and he's still very much working. Covered some pretty significant labor history, and I think, many moments that may have not felt quite as dire, but certainly felt quite dire. He's the author of Beaten Down, Worked Up, The Past, Present, and Future of American Labor, which if you've taken a labor studies course with me over the last 5 years, you probably either own or read excerpts from. In my opinion, it's a book that, it stands right alongside There's Power in a Union. And I think, from the folks who brought you the weekend, as just like, call them required readings for American labor history. What we see in these works and Stephen's journalism is that, labor history is, it's the history of the people, right? It's a history about people, kind of coming together, pushing back and demanding more. It's a story about people who have felt themselves to be beaten down and are worked up, people who are ready to fight, people who, like many of us on this Zoom right now, have to dig deep to meet the challenges of their particular moment, right? It's American labor history isn't always a feel-good story, but I think it is inspiring. So I want to thank you tonight, Stephen, for your work, for joining us, hopefully sharing a little bit of this inspiration. As always, I appreciate the expertise you bring to the topic. This is Stephen's second time joining us here at the LSP. We're going to stick to our standard format. We had some questions submitted ahead of time. But if you have questions during the presentation, feel free to jot them into the chat and we'll kind of work through them in turn. So please join me in giving our guest, Stephen Greenhouse, a warm LSP welcome.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Thanks very much for the kind introduction, Professor Miller. Always an honor to speak to the Bridges Center and looking forward to speaking to all of you. I want to begin by saying I'm sorry. I think Professor Miller picked the wrong person to speak to all of you tonight. For days, I was preparing remarks on how the nation's labor unions would help Kamala Harris win and provide the crucial margin of victory for for her in crucial swing states, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Nevada. I was going to talk about how labor unions would boast at their back that they're needed, that they're a bulwark of democracy. But I suspect that all of you are smart enough to have noticed by now that labor unions did not provide the margin of victory in those swing states or nationwide. So apologies, I got it wrong, but I hope you'll still put up with me speaking to you. So I've had to tear up my prepared remarks and start over. In the days leading up to November 5th, I received a bunch of boastful union emails from the service employees, from the retail wholesale workers, from the American Federation of State, County, Municipal Employees, other unions, about how unions are going to deliver victory to Harris. Unite Here, the Union of Hotel and Retail Work and Restaurant Workers, said its members had knocked on 4 million doors and had face-to-face conversations with 800,000 people. The Service Employees Union boasted that the SEIU and its partner programs reached out to over 7.2 million people this election cycle. The SEIU said it had an extraordinary milestone of 25,000 member volunteers during the election. Early on, the SEIU even boasted that it was spending $200 million on the campaign. The nation's unions made a strong case that they would make the crucial difference for Biden. They made a strong case that they made the crucial difference for Biden in 2020 in Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Nevada. And I think they really did. And they were saying they were going to make the crucial difference again in 2024. But all their work wasn't enough this year in 2024. All the union's horses and all the union's men and women weren't enough. If going into election day, Trump was winning in Wisconsin, Nevada, Michigan, and Pennsylvania by just 0.5 percentage point, then yes, unions could have made the crucial difference and delivered victory to Kamala Harris. But with Trump ahead by 3, 4, 5, 6% in some of these states, that was just too much for unions to make the crucial difference. Of course, if unions still represented 35% of the nation's workers as they did in the 1950s, or 20% of the nation's workers as they did in the 1980s, instead of representing just 10% of workers nowadays, if they still were at 25% of the workforce, that might have ensured that Democrats could have won in Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Nevada, Arizona, Georgia, North Carolina. Take Wisconsin. Union membership has plunged in that state from 15%, 1 in 6 workers in 2009, to just 7% nowadays, just 1 in 14 workers. I like that the nation's labor unions had the audacity of hope going into November 5th. They really thought they would make the difference. They really wanted to show they were vital to the Democratic Party. They were dead serious about defending our democracy. They really wanted to elect a candidate who would battle for workers and defend workers' rights. And union leaders were no doubt thinking strategically that if their unions delivered big time to Kamala Harris to help her win, then she would in turn deliver to union members and unions if she wins. Hey, that's the American way. Kamala Harris did win among voters in union households. Exit polls show that she received 53% of union household votes, while Trump won 45%. Union households are the union member and all the people living with him or her, with them, spouse, children, parent. So in union households, Harris won by an 8-point margin. I believe that's the smallest margin since Reagan won in the 1980s. That 8% margin for Harris is half the 16 percentage point margin that Biden won over Trump in 2020. That was 56 to 40%. And I should say, in non-union household, while Harris won in union households, in non-union households, Trump won by a 3 percentage point margin, 50% to 47%. I'm a numbers nerd. Forgive me. I'm going through all these numbers. Bear with me for another minute or two. So the margin in union households and the number of people in union households were too small to make up the difference to overcome the victory in non-union households. Union households represent about 18% of all voters. As for union voters, people who belong to unions, the AFL-CIO said that they voted for Harris by a 17 percentage point margin over Trump, like 57% to 39 or 40%. Allow me just a few more numbers. Looking at Michigan, for example, a crucial state. According to exit polls, union household voters in Michigan voted 58% to 40%, 58% for Harris, 40% for Trump, an 18-point margin. Remember, the UAW is extremely powerful there. The UAW is United Auto Workers are very vigorous on behalf of Harris. Union households made up more than 1 in 5 voters in Michigan. In Pennsylvania, union household voters performed even better than they did for Biden in 2000. Union household voters went 54 to 45 for Harris, a 9-point spread. In 2020, Biden actually lost union households in Pennsylvania to Trump, which is pretty amazing for Scranton Joe, right? So net, Harris did 10 percentage points better in Pennsylvania than Biden. So that shows that a real good union campaign can help. Okay, imagine that some of you, are sick of all these numbers, sick of me throwing all these numbers at you. You probably want to start throwing something at me. And I'm glad it's at Zoom, and I'm not standing in front of the room, so you're not throwing things at me. By now, some of you are wondering, if unions are so great, why is the margin of union members supporting Harris just a teeny bit over the number of union members supporting Trump? And that's a really important question. And related to that, some of you are no doubt also asking, why did the working class, or why did blue-collar voters favor Trump by such a large margin? That's, I've written lots of articles about this. I've written chapters of some of my books about this. One often used definition of blue-collar voters is voters who didn't attend college. That group of voters favored Trump over Harris by a colossal 28 percentage points, 63% to 35%. And they represent 15% of the population. As you well know, for decades, Franklin Roosevelt, after Franklin Roosevelt's presidency, American workers, blue-collar voters, overwhelmingly supported Democrats for decades. So FDR did amazing things during the Great Depression to help workers, to help lift them out of poverty, to enable them to unionize, to provide real safety nets, setting up Social Security, setting up unemployment insurance. I mean, he was a real hero to Americans, a real hero to blue-collar Americans, working-class Americans. But as many of you know, in recent decades, many working-class voters have soured on, even deserted the Democrats. Democrats are increasingly seen, fairly or unfairly, as the party of the coastal elites. Some people say they're the party of Wall Street, the party of Hollywood. Gosh, God forbid, the party of Beyonce and Jennifer Lopez. I guess it's okay, even though President George H.W. Bush, a Republican, negotiated the NAFTA trade treaty with Mexico and Canada, Democrats get the blame. Democrats are vilified over NAFTA because Bill Clinton was the person who pushed it through Congress, even though it was mainly Republicans in Congress that enabled it to be ratified. And then Bill Clinton pushed normalized trade relations with China in 2000. I realize this is before many of you were born. And many blue-collar workers, many communities are still angry about NAFTA and about normalized trade relations with China. According to an MIT study, it found that the normalized trade relations with China, which made it much easier for American companies to move jobs to China and import goods from China, that normalized trade relations with China destroyed 2 million American jobs, including nearly 1 million factory jobs. A study by the Economic Policy Institute, a progressive labor-backed research center, found that NAFTA caused the loss of 680,000 factory jobs in the US. And I just did a big article for The Guardian about, NAFTA was ratified in 1991, 33 years ago, yet many Democrats or former Democrats, blue-collar voters who were Democrats, are just super pissed off at the Democrats for having ratified NAFTA. Another problem as the Democrats sought to be, after Reagan, made it seem that, called the Democrats leftists, and many Democrats led by Bill Clinton said we have to be a more modern party, we have to be new Democrats, we have to be more centrist. And for years, the Democratic presidential candidates didn't really seem much like champions of workers. I'm thinking of Bill Clinton and Al Gore and John Kerry, and to some degree, Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton. Obama did run as a friend of workers, but really didn't deliver as much to nearly as much as blue collar workers wanted. And I was just speaking to a few workers who said, well, under Obama, we had, Obama inherited the horrible 2008 recession from George Bush, but he bailed out the banks, he bailed out Wall Street, but he didn't bail out millions of Americans who lost their homes during the financial crisis. And a lot of blue collar voters say, why the hell did Barack Obama help the rich, help Wall Street, and not help average Americans? And that's a cross the Democrats have to bear. Then came Donald Trump, who described himself as the world's greatest champion of workers. And I'm a New Yorker. I followed Donald Trump for 40 years. He's a very clever salesman, and that's the nicest thing I will say about him. He was very clever about blaming the Democrats for NAFTA. He promised he'd bring back the factory jobs. He said, he'll punish bad trading partners overseas. Trump once famously or infamously sought to woo union members in Youngstown, Ohio, once one of the real capital centers of the nation's steel industry. Trump, in a speech in Youngstown, said, he had just passed a bunch of deserted, depressed, shuttered factories, and he said, I will bring back all the jobs. And a lot of workers loved that. They sucked it up. But Trump was showing he cared, and they liked that, or he was showing that at least he made believe he cared. But of course, Trump did not bring back all the factory jobs to Ohio. He hardly brought back any factory jobs to Ohio, as he had promised. And during his 4 years in office, the number of factory jobs, manufacturing jobs in the US actually declined by 200,000, whereas under Joe Biden, and we all hear how it supposedly under Biden, the economy has been terrible. Trump says the worst ever. Under Biden-Harris, we've added 18 million jobs, the most in any 4-year presidential term. Under Biden, we've added over 700,000 factory jobs, the most again in any 4-year term under any president in US history. Another reason blue-collar voters have turned away from Democrats is the decline in union membership, from 35% of all workers in the 1950s to 25% in the 1980s to just 10% today, and just 6%, just 1 in 16 today in the private sector. For a story I did for The Guardian, I interviewed Steve Rosenthal, a former political director of the AFL-CIO, the nation's main labor federation. Rosenthal told me that he remembers going to Steelworkers Union Hall in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, several decades ago. He said it had 15 bowling lanes and a bar. Quote, around 30% of workers were in unions, Rosenthal said. At the time, around 10 or 15%, another 10% of voters were in union households. So like 45% of all voters were in union households in Pennsylvania. And a lot of other workers drank at the bar or bowled there at the Union Hall. The Steelworkers Hall served as a community center where people received information from the union, and there was robust support for Democrats. It was like people talked up unions, people talked up solidarity. The new book, Rust Belt Union Blues, describes a transformed landscape where many union halls have closed and gun clubs have often replaced them as the gathering places for the working class. And there, the ambience is pro-Trump. Tyler says he can't hear. I'll try to speak up louder. Okay. Peter Dreyer, a political science professor at Occidental College in Los Angeles, wrote an interesting analysis today about Trump's victory. Dreyer noted that according to exit polls, 57% of union members backed Harris-Walz to 39% for Trump. Dreyer wrote, if union membership today was 20% of all workers instead of 10%, that's if there are 29 million union members instead of the 14.5 million that there are today. And he said if 50% of them voted for Harris, as was the case, Harris would have won. So he's saying if unions were as strong as they were 20, 30 years ago, Harris would have won. And Dreyer went on to say unions used to be the key turnout machine for Democrats, the key get out the vote machine for Democrats. A stronger labor movement would have recruited more members to volunteer, had more money to invest in Democratic campaigns, put more resources into educating their members and others in the community about why to vote for the pro-worker candidate. And they'd even reach union members who might be gun owners or evangelical Christians. America's corporations and their Republican allies have spent decade after decade seeking to weaken and even destroy the labor movement, in part by weakening labor laws and weakening enforcement by the National Labor Relations Board. At the same time, corporations have been doing more and more elaborate and expensive union busting. Look at that great Seattle company, Amazon. Look at that other great Seattle company, Starbucks, at least until Starbucks finally signaled it would seek peace with its unions and get serious about finally reaching a first union contract more than 2 years after its, and yeah, we'll get to Aria, after its, some baristas first unionized here in New York State, in upstate Buffalo. There are now more than 500 unionized Starbucks, more than 12,000 unionized Starbucks workers. Not one of them has a union contract. Unions have indeed made somewhat of a comeback over the past 3 years at Starbucks, REI, Amazon, Trader Joe's, at Volkswagen in Tennessee, at Bluebird, a school bus manufacturer in Georgia, as many of you know, at universities and at hospitals. But unions can win only a limited number of victories at workplaces under current labor laws, which are tilted heavily toward corporations. Current labor law lets corporations engage in illegal anti-union activities like firing pro-union workers or closing recently unionized Starbucks stores without facing serious penalties. Indeed, they can't be fined 1 cent, not 1 penny, for any of their illegal activities. 70% of Americans say they approve of labor unions. That's the highest level in 60 years. I think a lot of Americans feel, especially young Americans, feel there's a ton of income inequality, that there isn't as much economic opportunity there was. I think many young people say this sucks. We're the first generation in American history that we're told is going to do worse than their parents. And I think a lot of people see unions as an important ladder, as an important way to pull them and their friends and their co-workers up. So 70% of Americans approve of unions, but public opinion doesn't win union elections. Smart organizing and solidarity win elections, but improved labor laws, would help hugely. The Democrats should have enacted labor law reforms to make it easier to unionize. They should have done that when they had the chance under Obama, when the Democrats had, held 60 seats in the Senate and could have overcome a filibuster. But the Democrats did not seize on that opportunity, and unions are paying for that now. Labor law reform should be a top priority if Democrats ever regain simultaneous control of the White House, the Senate, and the House of Representatives. And right now, that seems a distant dream, unfortunately. Let me tell you about one thing that bothered me in particular during the recent election. And maybe I'm getting into the weeds on this one. And that was the ton of media coverage about one union deciding not to endorse a candidate. And that was the Teamsters Union deciding not to endorse Kamala Harris. And the Teamsters were the only one of the nation's 10 largest unions not to endorse Kamala Harris. But it was crazy that the media paid more attention to the Teamsters non-endorsement than that got more media coverage than the endorsements of the 9 other large giant unions and of the AFL-CIO, the main union federation. So something was really weird, and that very much helped Trump, because a big, powerful, macho union, the Teamsters didn't endorse Harris. That was sort of a slap in the face, and that got a ton of attention. In truth, I was puzzled by the Teamsters non-endorsement. Sean O'Brien, the Teamsters president, said he wasn't going to let any party or president take his union for granted. But the truth is, if there was any president who did not take the Teamsters or labor unions for granted, it was Joe Biden. I believe that Joe Biden really has been the most pro-union president in American history. One could make the argument that Franklin Roosevelt did more for labor unions. He had, huge majorities in Congress, and under Roosevelt during the Great Depression, they passed very important pro-union legislation. But FDR didn't love unions so much. And Biden really loves unions in a very visible, manifest way. And under Biden, he twisted Congress's arm to pass something called the Butch-Lewis Act. So a lot of Teamster employers, trucking companies have pension plans, where they combine like the pension plans of 200, 300 companies together, have a multi-employer plan. And a lot of those pension plans were going bankrupt, were heading towards bankruptcy, and they really needed a rescue, or else, several million union members approaching retirement would maybe get 30 cents on the dollar, 40 cents on the dollar on their pension. And the Teamsters' number one legislative priority for years was something called the Butch-Lewis Emergency Pension Act. And under Biden, he really moved heaven and earth to get that enacted. And that saved the pensions of 2 million union members nationwide, including 400,000 Teamsters. That's a lot of Teamsters. And you would think the Teamsters would be very grateful for that. Biden was the first sitting president ever to walk on a union picket line. Many people said no president is ever going to walk on a picket line. They're too scared about upsetting the corporate overlords, so to speak. But Biden, nonetheless, during the UAW strike against GM, Ford, and Stellantis Chrysler last year, actually walked on a union picket line to support the workers. Biden passed some fairly extraordinary pieces of legislation that really help workers and really help unions. The $2 billion Infrastructure Act, the CHIPS Act to bring back semiconductor manufacturing to the United States, the Inflation Reduction Act, which is spending over $1 trillion to promote green energy, to promote electric vehicles, batteries. Those are creating hundreds and hundreds, probably over 1 million jobs. Maybe 500,000 of them will be union jobs. And I do think it's fair to say Biden is the most pro-union president in history. He supports raising the minimum wage to $15. That was blocked by Republicans. He supports a bill to make it easy to unionize, the Protecting the Right to Organize Act. That was also blocked by Republicans. And Kamala Harris was with him every step of the way. She too once walked on the UAW picket line. So I could see why many Democrats and many labor leaders were angry at the Teamsters when the Teamsters did not endorse Harris. I'm sure there are many conversations and curse words at various union headquarters saying, if the Teamsters aren't going to endorse Kamala Harris, then Democratic presidents and lawmakers are going to ask, why the hell should we stick our necks out and do any favors for labor unions, including big favors like the Butch-Lewis Act that bail out the pensions? Why should we do any favors for unions if a mighty union like the Teamsters with 1.3 million members is just going to stab us in the back and not endorse our presidential candidate? Another big surprise was the decision by the main firefighters union, the International Association of Firefighters, not to endorse Harris. Some of you remember that the very first campaign event when Joe Biden launched his campaign, his kickoff in 2020, was a rally with the firefighters union in Pittsburgh. They immediately endorsed him on like the first day of his campaign. So I guess I was just very surprised by the Teamsters non-endorsement. And an unusual move, and I should say, Kamala Harris cast the deciding vote to keep the Butch-Lewis Act alive, to keep it from dying. Like, she did a huge favor for the Teamsters union. In an unusual move, Sean O'Brien, the Teamsters president, spoke at the Republican convention as part of his effort to show that he believes unions wouldn't be and shouldn't be taken for granted, and wanted to talk to both parties. O'Brien's hope was that in return, Trump and the Republican Party would be nicer to labor unions. For decades, Republicans have, wanted to, have really done the bidding of corporations and opposed legislation to make it easier to unionize, appointed people, who would make it harder to unionize. So O'Brien gave the speech at the Republican convention, hoping that the Republicans would start making nice to unions. But 3 days later, Trump, in his acceptance speech, really stabbed unions in the back by this is in his acceptance speech. He attacked the United Auto Workers and the United Auto Workers president by name, Sean Fain, and said Sean Fain should be, quote, fired immediately. Like, what the hell is someone in his acceptance speech saying a union president should be fired? Like, anyway, Trump is Trump. I would have thought that out of solidarity with other unions, that O'Brien and the Teamsters would be so angry about how Trump treated the UAW that they would endorse Harris. I was also surprised that the Teamsters didn't endorse Harris, because a few days after the Republican convention, Trump, in a Twitter conversation with the humongously anti-union billionaire Elon Musk, in that conversation, Trump applauded the idea of Musk and other corporate leaders firing workers who are on strike. To fire workers who are on strike is illegal under federal law, but Trump said it's a great idea. Sean O'Brien of the Teamsters condemned those remarks very angrily. What could be worse for unions? What could do more to weaken unions than backing the idea of companies firing workers who are on strike? Nonetheless, Sean O'Brien got the Teamsters not to endorse Harris, even though Trump was anti-union and Harris was very pro-union. O'Brien pointed to an internal Teamsters poll showing that its rank and file overwhelmingly supported Trump over Harris. I would be remiss if I didn't say that I'm sure that racism and misogyny most likely came into play in why the Teamsters rank and file tilted so heavily in favor of Trump. So the Teamsters and the firefighters' non-endorsements reminded me in ways of the Washington Post and the LA Times non-endorsements. You're going to say, what am I talking about? Tim Snyder, the great historian on authoritarian regimes at Yale, described it as anticipatory obedience, that the Washington Post, Jeff Bezos, the LA Times were scared that if they endorsed Harris and Trump was elected, they'd be in Trump's doghouse and they'd be on his list of folks to seek revenge against. So like anticipatory obedience. And I think both the Teamsters and the firefighters worried, hey, there's a good chance Trump will win. If we endorse Harris, we're going to be in the doghouse, and Trump is going to try to step on our head. For an article I wrote for the Guardian newspaper recently, I asked Steve Rosenthal, the former AFL-CIO political director, what he thought about Sean O'Brien orchestrating the Teamsters non-endorsement. And let me just say, so O'Brien could say, well, it would be anti-democratic for me, undemocratic for me to endorse Harris when a majority of my members say they support Trump. And this is what Steve Rosenthal said. He's a very respected guy in the labor movement. He said the job of a leader like O'Brien is to lead. If you believe there are clear-cut differences and there's a lot at stake for your union's members, such as, such as between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris, it's your responsibility as a leader, as a union leader, to make the case to your state and local leaders and your members. It's the union's job to communicate the difference between the candidates. It's the union's responsibility to educate its members and get them to support the candidate who will stand with workers and support unions and try to make things better for the nation's workers. A big contract to the Teamsters was the United Auto Workers. They enthusiastically and vigorously endorsed Harris. An internal union poll showed that UA members overwhelmingly supported Harris over Trump. Sean Fain, the UAW president, did lots of really smart videos explaining why he thought Trump was bad for workers and bad for unions and why Harris would be much better. And one of those, and that video showed Harris walking on the UAW picket line. In an article I wrote for The Guardian, I quoted UAW President Sean Fain saying that Biden's and Harris's policies were, quote, actually building manufacturing here. For the UAW and many unions, a big concern was the decline in manufacturing. Fain said that Trump's, quote, trickle-down policies, unquote, have led to all these jobs leaving America. Fain said that under Trump's presidency, it was, quote, more of the same, the rich getting richer, keep outsourcing our work, and the handful at the top and the shareholders take all the money, and the workers who create the wealth get left behind. The majority of our members get that, understand that, Fain said. Okay, I hope I haven't given the impression that unions are feckless, that unions are ineffective in elections. That's not true. Let's take the example, I've written 2 books, The Big Squeeze, Tough Times for the American Worker, and this book, Beaten Down, Worked Up, The Past, Present, and Future of American Labor. And in both books, I wrote a chapter about what's probably the most amazing union local in the United States, the Culinary Union in Las Vegas, which represents 60,000, 70,000, waiters, housekeepers, bartenders. And unfortunately, in this election was the first time in like 30 years that Nevada went Republican. And in my book and elsewhere, people said that, that the main force that kept Nevada Democratic was the Culinary Union, which had such a powerful political operation, knocking on doors across the state. And I think one of the reasons Harris lost in Nevada this time around is that so many casino workers, hotel workers, restaurant workers are just shell-shocked by the pandemic, by the recession that was caused by the pandemic, by the inflation. There was, tourism really died in Las Vegas for a while, and people were really hurting there. They had the highest unemployment rate in the nation, and just they wanted a change. Oh, I should also say, since I'm speaking to all these people in Washington State, I heard on the radio today that Washington State and Utah were the only states in the nation where Harris did better than Biden, got a higher percentage than Biden did. So let's hear it for Washington. Another example is the runoff for 2 Senate seats in Georgia in early 2021, when Raphael Warnock and Jon Ossoff were running against Republican opponents in a runoff. Each day, over 1,000 of Unite Here's, that's the hotel workers union, 1,000 of Unite Here's housekeepers, cooks, dishwashers, airport concession workers, who are mostly women, mostly people of color, canvass full-time in the Atlanta, Georgia area and the Columbus, Georgia area. They knocked on over 1.5 million doors. Each day, union members had 15,000 face-to-face conversations with voters. Raphael Warnock won that race 51% to 49%. Ossoff won it 50.5% to 49.5% by just 1 percentage point, by just 50,000 votes. I think it's fair to say that labor made the crucial difference there, and thus helped. And with those 2 victories of Warnock's and Ossoff's, that really enabled the Democrats to win control of the Senate of the past few years. I remember early on the afternoon of January 6, 2021, I was interviewing the national president of Unite Here, the Hotel Workers Union, Dee Taylor. And he was urging me, saying, Greenhouse, you ought to do a story about the wonderful job we did canvassing and campaigning in Georgia to enable the Democrats to win, to enable Warnock and Ossoff to win the 2 seats, and for the Democrats to win control of the Senate. Truth be told, I never wrote that story. I got distracted. We all got distracted because something horrible was happening that very afternoon on Capitol Hill on January 6th. Separately, I interviewed Gwen Mills, who is that union's Unite Here secretary treasurer. And she told me, sorry, I'm starting to get hoarse. She told me that our union's goal was to have over 1,000 union members canvassing in key races in 2020. Going door to door, she said, quote, reigniting people to vote. Gwen Mills told me, we try to keep a drumbeat year in and year out. Do democracy at work, have members get involved in democracy, in union meetings and running for union office. Do democracy at work. Do democracy at the doors. Do democracy at the polls. Do democracy in the capital, in the state capital, and in the nation's capital. And Unite Here, is a terrific union in terms of getting its members involved in fighting for better conditions at the hotels, at the airports, at the restaurants they work for. But they also do an amazing job in politics. And this is a union that's majority female, majority people of color, workers of color, and they're really a standout in what they do in politics. And I so admire them. Okay, now let me turn to some depressing stuff. I should talk for a few minutes about what Trump's victory will mean for workers and unions. I've been going on a while now, so I'll try to do this fast. So I'll go through a list of about 10 things pretty quickly. Trump's advisors say that on his very first day in office, he will fire Jennifer Abruzzo. She's the general counsel of the National Labor Relations Board. Unions love her. She's the most pro-worker, pro-union general counsel for the NLRB in maybe in forever, and she's really helped Starbucks workers and Amazon workers who are trying to unionize. Second, Trump will no doubt appoint pro-corporate, anti-union members to the National Labor Relations Board, just as he did in his first term. Trump says he will impose tariffs on up to 20% on all imports and 60% on all imports from China. Trump, as we know, loves to bash China and blame China for everything, and blame immigrants for everything too, of course. And Trump says that's supposed to help workers and restore factory jobs. I interviewed Dave McCall, president of the United Steelworkers Union. He recently told me Trump's across-the-board tariffs are a terrible idea, worrying it could spark a trade war that would hurt workers in the United States and overseas, and also hurt the U.S. economy and cause huge layoffs. McCall told me, I don't think the solution to the problem is to have tariffs for the sake of having tariffs. That's protection. I think trade is a good thing. It's an economic stimulus. McCall said the U.S. should use tariffs not in a blunderbuss across the board way. A blunderbuss is the gun that Elmer Fudd used to use. It would shoot all over the place. I don't know if you folks remember Elmer Fudd. Anyway, he said tariffs should be used, in a targeted way to punish cheaters or countries that dump their various products. Trump has said he will eliminate taxes on tips and on overtime, and workers love that. They say, oh, I don't want my tips to be taxed. I don't want my overtime to be taxed. But many workers who receive tips make $20,000, $25,000 a year, and they don't even pay any income taxes. So the promise not to tax tips might not, it sounds great, but it might not mean much for workers. When Trump made believe he was a worker and as a McDonald's French fry cook, remember a few weeks ago, he was asked whether he would support a higher minimum wage. And guess what? This great friend of workers, refused to answer. He dodged the question. Great, courageous Donald Trump would not say whether he supports a higher minimum wage. The federal minimum wage has been $7.25 an hour for more than 15 years. Since the summer of 2009, it hasn't budged. That's unbelievable. Trump would make it harder for gig workers like Uber drivers, janitors, home care aides to be declared to be considered employees. By being considered employees, they would be protected by minimum wage laws. They would be protected by overtime laws. Their employees would have to contribute to their Social Security. Trump, as he did in his first term, is expected to make it harder for gig workers. Under Trump, the National Labor Relations Board will no doubt rule that graduate student workers at private universities don't have the right to unionize or bargain collectively. Trump will no doubt roll back safety regulations, no doubt rule that fewer workers qualify for overtime protections. He will greatly reduce protections for federal workers. He will make maybe 50,000. Now only 4,000 federal workers are political appointees. He wants to make 50,000 federal workers political appointees. It will kind of bring back the old spoils system, the patronage-based spoil system where you would get a job if your political machine, if your political boss recommended you. And one of the, there are many problems with the old spoil system. People made payoffs to get jobs. Once you're appointed, you just sat on your ass and just, or you just do the work for the political machine and not do work for the US public. One last thing. So I imagine many of you have heard of Project 2025. One of its big recommendations is to abolish public sector unions, meaning abolish unions for police officers, abolish unions for firefighters, abolish unions for social workers, abolish unions for teachers. And that would be really, would greatly weaken the union movement, would greatly hurt, millions and millions of workers in trying to get better wages and better conditions. I could talk for an hour about, how Trump will hurt workers and hurt unions, but I've been going on too long and I should take questions. So I want to conclude with what two of the nation's most prominent labor leaders said in response to Tuesday's election results. This is a quote from Liz Schuler, the president of the AFL-CIO. Presidential administrations change, but the labor movement's values do not. We stand for the freedom to organize and for the right to collectively bargain. We stand for solidarity, the kind that is built when working people stand together to take on the biggest, richest bosses, and the most powerful extremist politicians. Most importantly, we know how to fight back when anyone comes after our freedoms. Schuler continued, now we are faced with the reality of a second Donald Trump term. The Project 2025 agenda promises to dismantle labor unions because we are a pillar of democracy and a check on corporate power. We've seen assaults on our fundamental rights before. In the days, months, and years ahead, labor's task will be to defend working people when we're attacked again. Second quote is from April Verrett, president of the Service Employees International Union. Verrett said, we are not defeated. We are determined, and we won't back down. We remain united to each other and to our vision for a healthy, joyful, and prosperous future. And we're not going to let anyone divide us based on racism, sexism, or fear. SRU's 2 million members did monumental work in this election, reaching more than 7 million voters in 12 languages. We are putting corporations, billionaires, and extremist politicians on notice. We see you. We know just what you're trying to do, and we won't back down. We know what it's like to face down bullies. We know how to keep going, to care for each other, to face down systems built to keep us out of power and divided. We will fight back by organizing, mobilizing, and winning worker power. We will not allow anyone to take away our fundamental rights and freedoms. Hear us. When you attack just one of us, you're attacking every worker who makes our communities, our economy, and our nation strong. I should stop there because I cannot be as articulate as April Verrett was, and I'd be happy to take your questions. And I'm sorry if I started to get a little hoarse.
That is a great quote to end on. And before we transition into Q&A, let's have another round of digital applause for our guest tonight, Stephen Greenhouse.
Thanks.
That was fantastic. I think, I mean, there are a ton of takeaways that I know we've got folks with questions, so go ahead and raise your hand, but just some initial thoughts. I think, this idea of democracy being something that you do, right? And unions providing a vehicle to sort of doing democracy in the workplace. It's not just a once every 4-year civic obligation. But the fact of the matter is that, that unions provide an opportunity for, workers to come together and make decisions democratically. And I think, yeah, like you're spot on. It's, I think the numbers are a little overwhelming. But the fact of the matter is unions attempted to turn out. I mean, with the exception of this, the Teamsters that loom large, and I think that there are some definite reasons connected to sexism and racism, as you mentioned, connected to why they sort of occupy this space within the American labor imagination. but you know, the numbers that matter, right? It's like as union density declines, as that wanes, so does the political influence of organized workers. And this is part of a, you know, it's a part of a project that you've been tracking in your work, you know, that dates back pretty much as, you know, immediately after the New Deal, right? It started the clawing back of these workplace rights began. Yeah, I mean, I think that there are, you know, even today, even 2 days removed from an election that I know didn't leave everybody feeling totally optimistic. I think there was work and organizing that was done during this election that points toward a future, and I think it has something to do with just kind of like reframing the way we think about, you know, what the American working class is, right? And it's, you know, it is the UAW and it is the Teamsters, right? But it's the Culinary Union and it's SEIU and it's a different sort of worker that sort of occupies a different space within how we think about labor in America. And I think that like we're kind of like, you know, I've heard the term realignment used a lot in the last 2 days, and I think that we're also in a moment of like labor realignment and rethinking sort of who, you know, what a unionized American workforce looks like. So yeah, I just really, you know, can't thank you enough for the expertise you bring to the table. Um, and I see Diane has a hand up.
Right.
Hi,
Uh,
Dan.
hi. Um, hey, Steve, Diane Sosney. I'm now retired from
Okay,
SEIU 1199 Northwest.
good to see you. I'm
Yeah.
still retired too, but I'm really not. So
Yeah. Well, me kind of not too. Um, so I first of all, this was very interesting. Thank you for that overview and your observations. I took a group of basically 10 retired, mainly nurses, to Maricopa County, Arizona, to work on the presidential and the Senate race. And we don't have, I was just checking, we still don't have a result on the Gallego Lake race, although Gallego is ahead. I would say
2%.
from my many years in the labor movement and in first the National Union, 1199, and then SEIU, that this election is absolutely a clarion call to organize new workers and to organize ourselves as the labor movement and within our various unions to put the resources, the expertise, the training needed, mobilization, et cetera, to launch 2.0, 3.0, I don't know what it would be, movement to organize at maximum speed and capacity. And we can see that while Kamala Harris was a great candidate and in so many ways ran a great campaign, when the economy is bad, for an incumbent, it doesn't help you get reelected. And she was really an extension and couldn't differentiate herself from Biden. But the other thing I would say, we knocked on, I'd say, close to 7,000 doors, about 12 of us, spoke to close to 2,000 people. These were low income, middle income, very diverse, ethnically diverse communities. And while we found, Harris supporters and worked to make voter plans, what was clear was what Trump offered people, and this relates to the low density of unionization and Alex, your remark about what unions help people experience around collective democracy is that these voters, they just talked about groceries or more. I am working 2 jobs. I, don't have money to raise my family. And Trump portrays himself as, I get your problem and I'm going to fix it for you, and you don't have to do anything about it. I'm the self-proclaimed, billionaire who's been so successful, and I can do what I've done for myself for you, and you don't have to do anything about it. And I think as the Democratic Party, they're going to have to go through an incredible deep dive and transformation, and really reinvent. I don't know if that's even the right word, but that the labor movement has a lot to teach, and we have to have a louder voice, and a working families party, because we know how to talk to people and message people, but we also have to get results in putting people in unions. So that's what I would add.
Thank you, Diane. So responding to what Professor Miller said, what you said. So I totally agree that, for the good of the nation, for the good of trying to create more social justice, economic justice, less inequality, it would be great for unions to continue building and organizing. And yes, the fact that the Democrats lost and did badly this election, although it's great that Gallego is going to probably beat Kari Lake, it's all the more important that unions grow in strength to help build a fair nation and also help elect Democrats. To me, what happened in this election, is in ways very simple. Harris lost because, and you said, and many journalists say the economy is bad. I submit the economy is not bad. I submit that there's a huge misperception that the economy is bad. Inflation is down to 2.4%. Unemployment is 4%. GDP growth is by far the highest of any industrial nation, but we've had 20% inflation over the past 4 years, and many people say that sucks. That's made life miserable. I say I've been writing about workers in the nation for 40 years. 40 years ago under Reagan, 30 years ago under Clinton, millions and millions of workers were saying life sucks, life is too expensive. I realize that with the 20% inflation, many workers are squeezed. Although, again, studies show that wages for the average worker have risen faster than inflation. But that hasn't been the case for all workers. That's been for many workers, wages haven't kept up and they're really squeezed. And I think Donald Trump, and I hope this doesn't come across as insensitive, again, the number of workers working 2 jobs is not really higher than it was 5 and 10 and 15 years ago. But we're hearing much more about it because there's something about Donald Trump that gets the media to pay more attention and people to unhappy workers and gets people to, in ways, vent more about their struggles. I don't know. So if the economy, if we didn't have, and in every, in Italy and France and Germany and Britain and, you name the nation, generally the ruling party has been voted out of power or done far, far, far worse over the past 5 years because of inflation. And even though inflation was caused by the pandemic and by the war in Ukraine, the folks in power get blamed. So and Harris just lost by what, 3-4 million votes, not by a huge amount. So in a certain way, I don't, people are saying this is a huge victory for Trump. Some people say this shows that the Democrats need a fundamental realignment. I imagine if the Democrats had nominated someone else who wasn't so closely tied to Biden, that person might have won. I think I agree, Harris ran a terrific campaign, but she was really held back by being so closely tied to Biden. Anyway, I'm talking too much. We should take the next question.
Okay, next up we've got Diana's had their hand up for a while.
No, it's fine. I've actually got a few, but I'll hold out on most of them. I guess my biggest concern, at least in your article, Project 2025's plan to get civil service and mass firings. You mentioned the role of Brian Kelly regarding the East Palestine, Ohio's train derailment. And I was somewhat like very reminded of HBO's Chernobyl series of how like it showed the politically affiliated regulators with no experiences in their field made these decisions that caused absolute chaos. And um, I guess in his weakening of the 1883's Pendleton Act is just one example of the Trump party's willingness to find old laws to either exploit power or weaken safeguards that protect that sort of balance of power. And he like ultimately shows his like willingness to appoint those completely loyal to him. Do you think there are any safeguards like the Pendleton Act that could prevent him from replacing appointees, or conversely, regulation and acts that support this type of executive power? So pick or choose, it's fine. So I'm just interested in either of those points.
Okay. Diana, that's a great question. Just some background. So the Pendleton Act was passed in 1883 under, I think, Grover Cleveland, right? Or I forget, you know,
Yeah.
anyway, you know, the last president to have two separate terms. Anyway, and you know, people were disgusted with the spoil system, which was so corrupt. So the Pendleton Act tried to make sure that federal employees were appointed based on merit, based on professionalism, based on competitive exams. And you know, that created a professional, more efficient, more dedicated civil service. And Trump wants to weaken the civil service. And as I said, you know, instead of having just 4,000 political appointees, having 50,000. And many people say that would be bad because if you have, for instance, a food inspector or an inspector of chemical pollution in the water, in the air, you know, if that polluter or if that food company is a huge donor to a president, to Donald Trump or whoever, you know, there might be pressure, you know, if the person's a political appointee and knows that, you know, they could be fired if they, you know, tomorrow without civil service protections, if they say, you know, that company, you know, that corporate, you know, that big friend of Trump corporate donor is polluting illegally or is you know, producing what's it called, not knockwurst, liverwurst with listeria. You know, their boss might say, if you report that publicly, you're going to get fired. So your question, Diana, was, you know, what are the protections to prevent messing up the system like that? You know, there can be lawsuits that the federal unions will bring, that workers will bring, saying Trump can't go too far to weaken the civil service, can't go too far to weaken the Pendleton Act. And it will, you know, and the courts can rule on the exact language of the Pendleton Act. You know, this particular job should be a civil service job. It shouldn't be. Basically, Trump wants to change things to be able to fire many more workers at will. Once you become a political appointee, you can be fired, you know, if they don't like, you know, the color of your eyelashes, or they get pissed off about you criticizing the president. So that's the big advantage of civil service protections. So there will be big fights in the courts to try to protect the rights of federal workers. And a lot will come down to who are the judges. And Trump will be appointing a lot of judges, and a lot of Trump's judges. You know, as a journalist, I wanted to do stories that, like, every time, you know, it seems that half the pro-worker regulations that Biden adopted, 3 months later, a federal district court judge in Texas, who was appointed by Trump, says, oh, this is going too far, this violates this or that, you know. So yeah, yes, there are protections, but a lot of it will be up to judges, increasingly conservative judges, about whether to protect federal workers.
Ooh, that's scary.
It's
I don't know why.
going to allow industry to police itself, and when they can't police themselves, they'll go to friendly courts to make
Let me just
decisions.
interrupt so, you know, one thing I should have mentioned is, like, as unions have unfortunately grown weaker, as the percentage of workers in unions have grown weaker, the political activity of billionaires, of the super rich, has really increased. So one result is, I'd say that Bernie Sanders and Sherrod Brown in Ohio are the two most pro-worker people in the Senate. And Sherrod Brown's a wonderful guy. And he lost his election because all these crypto billionaires in Silicon Valley donated $40 million to his Republican opponent, a used car dealer, I think. And so Sherrod Brown, one of the two best friends of workers in the Senate, has lost. And unions fought tooth and nail to keep, and many other people did, to keep Sherrod Brown in the Senate. But when you're up against the billionaires, it's really hard. And the Supreme Court in the Citizens United decision really gave a very bright green light to billionaires to give, Elon Musk probably gave more than $150 million in this election to help Trump. Timothy Mellon gave $125 million. Miriam Adelson gave $100 million. So $125 million, that's 3 million people giving $40. So the political system has increasingly been polluted and influenced and swayed and tilted by the huge power of billionaires. And that's really messing up our democracy in a big way.
Excellent question, Diana. I never thought I'd long for the first Gilded Age when our capitalist overlords were philanthropists. I see, Lewis, you have a hand up.
Yes, I was actually, it was a very good presentation. Thank you for presenting. And it's actually related to your article about Sean O'Brien. And just a speculation, but how do you see the Teamsters manage potential conflicts between like pro-Trump and pro-union policies if Trump's administration rolls out anti-union legislations?
That's a great question, Louis. I think on one hand, O'Brien wants to be seen as Trump's best friend in labor. And some people said maybe he'll be appointed labor secretary. I say that would be a step down for him. He has much more power and much more prominence as president of the Teamsters. So on one hand, he wants to be seen as Trump's best friend in labor. He'll be a big shot. On the other hand, O'Brien is pro-union and will try to do his best while trying to remain in Trump's good graces to try to, subtly fight efforts to weaken unions. And you ask a really good question. It's not clear how he's going to walk that tightrope, whether he'll be able to do it without falling off. So.
Well, it's interesting too.
And I should just say, and a lot of rank and file Teamsters are angry at hell at Sean O'Brien, saying, how could you not back Kamala Harris because she's so pro-union? She's done so much for us.
Well, and I mean, Trump's buddying up with Elon Musk, who's, notoriously anti-union and also a, major manufacturer of automobiles. It seems like a very, it's either 3D chess or it's a strategy that doesn't seem like it's going to have much shelf life. But I mean, I think, politically speaking, folks who align themselves with Trump typically don't benefit in the long term. Like it seems like they're typically short-term transactions. I see we got a couple more hands up here. I want to be mindful of time, and Stephen is zooming in from New York City, so also mindful of the fact that it's 10 o'clock now out there. Maxwell.
Thank you. Okay, hold on. Thank you so much, Mr. Greenhouse. This question kind of is not it isn't very related to the labor. It's more related to like the current issues in like labor and the unfortunate election of President Trump. But I just wanted to ask, like, how did you become a labor journalist? What kind of path did you take in college to get to where you are?
So I was a sports editor of my high school newspaper. I was always interested in journalism. I went to Wesleyan University in Middletown, Connecticut. I went thinking I would become a lawyer. I became editor-in-chief of my college newspaper, and I really felt a passion for for being a journalist. I love writing. I love going out and interviewing people. And it's like one of the great things about being a journalist is like you get to explore the world and pursue your curiosities and interests. Plus, you get to write, and if you love to write, that's fun. I kind of grew up in a lefty family. My parents were involved in the labor movement. I always used to have arguments when my father was vice president of his local teachers union, and I also, would say, why do teachers make so much more money than journalists? It's unfair. Teachers are overpaid. I got my father really mad at me when I said that. I said, and you have summers off and we don't. Anyway, so I I got a job as a lackey at the New York Times right after college. Then I went to Columbia Journalism School, got a master's degree, and I worked for a few years at a good daily newspaper in New Jersey. I was a little frustrated, unhappy with the people who ran it, and I thought I should prepare for a different career. So I went to law school at NYU. But at law school, I realized it's more fun and interesting and stimulating, but a lot less lucrative, being a journalist than being a lawyer. So after I went to law school, I had the great fortune of being hired by the New York Times because in the year after I left college, when I was a lackey at the New York Times, I did a whole bunch of writing, when I was, 21 years old, and impressed a lot of editors, and they said, oh, this Greenhouse guy is halfway smart. Let's, take a gamble on him. So I became a reporter, and, first I was a business reporter covering the steel industry, covering basic industry. I remember I went out to Washington State to cover I think a Kaiser aluminum strike in the middle of winter, and I was standing out at midnight at the burn barrels as the strikers were outside freezing their tushies off, with the barrel filled with wood to keep them warm. It was pretty crazy. And so I've always, I was in, I'm talking too much. I was in Paris for the New York Times for 5 years as European economics correspondent. I was in Washington for a few years, covering the State Department, and I wanted to write about human beings again. And so I requested the labor beat because I thought that way I could write about human beings, and I could write about social justice issues, and I could write about workers, who are being, screwed at work, who face sexual discrimination, racial discrimination, who weren't paid minimum wage. There was a time when the number of immigrant workers in the U.S. was really growing, and there was massive exploitation of them. And it was a beat I was really enthusiastic about. And I covered labor for the New York Times 19 years, so I was very happy doing that. And I recommend journalism as a profession, although with the decline of so many newspapers and the going out of business of so many newspapers, it's much harder to get a good journalism job than it used to be, I'm sorry to say.
Nice, thanks. I don't know if I knew the full backstory. That's really fascinating. Great question. I love a good origin story question too. We've got time for maybe, well, I guess we have 3 more hands up, maybe 3 more questions. Cayman?
Hi. Um, with Trump advocating for right to work laws and having openly supported firing striking workers, how can unions effectively counter policies that directly threaten worker protections? And to what extent can pro-union administration like Biden-Harris offer unique avenues to strengthen union rights?
That's the $64 billion question, Cayman. That's a good question. So a big fear among union leaders is that Trump is going to come in and try to pass, with the Project 2025 folks, is going to try to pass some legislation that would seriously weaken unions, such as the Project 2025 calls for, abolishing all public sector unions. Trump plays footsie about whether he knows about Project 2025 or whether he supports Project 2025. In the past, he said he'd support nationwide right to work legislation. I generally don't love the filibuster when the Democrats are in power, but now that it looks like, the Republicans are going to control the White House and the Senate and the House of Representatives, thank God that there's the filibuster, so that, as long as the Democrats have more than 40 seats in the Senate, it looks like they'll end up with 46 or so, 45, 46. That should prevent the Republicans from getting the 60 votes they would need to pass, say, a national right to work law, or to pass a law that would ban all public sector unions. So it's important for unions, as Diane Sosny said, to continue organizing, to continue doing tons of politics, to make sure that there are at least, there are more than 40 Democratic senators, and to do a lot of lobbying, and to make their issues known. And I know, so in the state of New Hampshire, for instance, there have been many efforts to pass a right to work law, but the unions have been successful in persuading many Republicans to oppose a right to work law, because they make a good case that workers like unions, and unions do a lot for them, and it's unfair if workers in right to work states can enjoy all the benefits of a union without paying a cent for the union that bargains for them and wins them better raises and safer working conditions. So I think the filibuster is a big protection for unions against anti-union legislations, and unions have to keep on organizing and trying to grow and trying to wield their political power to make sure that they have the might and have enough friends in Washington to prevent bad things from happening, or worse things from happening. Hope that makes sense, Cayman.
That is a big question, and there is a ton that needs to be done. How about Theo?
Any thoughts on increasing the presence and outreach of the Democratic Party and unions in rural America?
Oh, that's a tough question, Theo. Unions, I agree totally with Diane that unions should be really, trying to double, triple the amount of work they do, and unions in ways go to where the bodies are, where the workers are, and there are many more workers to unionize generally in cities than in rural communities. But, look at what's happening at Starbucks. The workers have unionized in many smaller towns, even some rural communities. So, I think the Democrats are trying harder to win in rural communities, and unions, like Starbucks Workers United is certainly trying to do more in rural communities. And as I said, if there weren't for this, terrible inflation 3 years ago, and if all these American voters weren't, realized that the economy is, I sound like a total coastal elitist in saying that many people, are wrong to say the economy is in horrible shape. I understand a lot of people are suffering from inflation still, but by most measures, our economy is really doing quite well. And I imagine, if just people are pissed about the pandemic, people are pissed about the inflation. If they weren't so pissed about those things, I think the Democrats would have done much better in rural areas, and and across the states. And Democrats, I think, realize they have to do more in rural areas, and unions are trying to make gains where they can, and they generally do more in the cities, because that's where workplaces are larger, and they often focus drives on larger workplaces. Although look at I mentioned the Bluebird school bus in Georgia. They won in a rural community, in a right to work state. Georgia's a very conservative anti-union state. So, and the UAW's efforts in the South to organize, Japanese transplants and German transplants and Korean transplants, those are, it's no coincidence those auto plants are in small rural towns, because, those companies thought it would be harder to unionize workers in small rural towns. And the UAW is, and not just the UAW, the steelworkers, the machinists are trying harder to organize, some factories in rural towns. So I think they agree with you, Theo.
Excellent. That was a great question. So last question of the night, I believe it's Bader.
Hello.
Hi, Bader.
A question I had is, as shown by the transition to electric vehicle production and its implications for auto workers, adapting to new industry standards can reduce job numbers. How can unions advocate for modernization in industries without compromising members' job security?
you know, that again, that's another 64 million. You know, that's a great question. You know, I think Donald Trump says the UAW is stupid and Sean Fain should be fired because they agreed to go along with Joe Biden's push to produce more electrical vehicles and to transition the nation's economy to more electric vehicles, to a more sustainable energy supply. And you know, the UAW says, you know, global warming is a problem. Donald Trump, you don't seem to understand that. You keep saying it's a hoax. And the UAW doesn't want all, you know, internal combustion engine plants closed overnight because that would be terrible for its members, right? So it's trying to, again, I'm going to use the say walk a tightrope. It wants to support the transition to electrical vehicles at a respectable pace while preserving, you know, many internal combustion car plants, so that as few jobs as possible are lost as we make the transition. And that's very much what I think the Biden administration is very smart. And I've written that. So when Biden says it's, you know, the United States should, you know, until, you know, Trump jumped into bed with Elon Musk and made Musk his boyfriend, you know, you know, and really, you know, wanted this support from the world's richest person. You know, Trump was humongously against electric vehicles, right? But suddenly, when Musk said he would support Trump and campaign for Trump, suddenly Trump said he supports electric vehicles, right? But Trump said, but I'm against the subsidies to purchase electric vehicles. And Biden and the Democrats in Congress and the nation's law, the Inflation Reduction Act, basically says to make the transition from internal combustion engine cars to EVs, we need subsidies to encourage people to buy EVs. And the UAW says that's a great idea. And Trump says, no, we don't want any subsidies. And I think Trump basically wanted to destroy the electrical vehicle industry, saying it's just, he says it's totally bad for American workers. It's totally bad for the UAW. But what Trump doesn't realize is that if we were to destroy the electrical vehicle industry in the United States, we would fall far behind the electrical vehicle industry in China and Italy and Germany and Japan. And the American car industry would ultimately be crippled because we'd be so far behind the others in a crucial industry as the problem of global warming grew worse and worse, grew more and more manifest. So I think, you know, Sean Fain, I think he's being very smart about it. I think, you know, they realize, you know, we have to make this transition, you know, and there'll be more and more EV plants, there'll be more and more battery plants, you know, and we have to set up all these recharging stations, which will need maintenance, and that will create a lot of jobs. So some of the jobs lost for people who work in internal combustion engine plants can get jobs at EV plants or in recharging stations. So they're trying to make this historic and difficult transmission while preserving as many jobs as possible. And it ain't easy. But I think Trump has a very simplistic view that, you know, he calls global warming a hoax. And he, you know, says until he started romancing Elon Musk, he said, you know, electric vehicles are dumb and unnecessary. And he wants a much, you know, he wanted to kill the electrical vehicle industry. Now he wants a much slower transition to electrical vehicles. But, you know, I think people are seeing more and more how fast global warming is coming upon us and how hugely damaging it is to the nation and to the world. So I think more and more people see the need for transitioning to electrical vehicles. And I think Sean Fain and the UAW is right that we need to make the transition, and we need to do it in a way that you know, also protects workers at the same time.
Excellent. That was a great question. I know I said that would be the final question, but then I got back channeled by somebody who I didn't even realize was on the call. Mike Honey's here. He wanted to ask you one question.
Mike
before the
Honey,
end of the-
wow. Hi, Mike.
Hi, Steve. Thanks for doing this. I was really interested to hear what you were going to say the day after this disastrous, 2 days after this disastrous election. So I even took some notes, and I'll look up your recent article and also the one by Peter Dreyer that you mentioned is really helpful, I think, too. But my question real quick is, and thanks again, is just since the labor law is so terrible and it's never, when I was the president of LACHA, we tried to pass under Obama, labor law reform. It didn't happen. And so without that, and it's not going to happen now, is there a way through sort of card check type arrangements with employers for people to organize unions outside of the labor law?
Great question, Professor Honey, and I'm a big admirer of yours. So yes and no. I mean, one of the recommendations in Project 2025 is to ban card check altogether. And Alex, should I explain card check to everyone in your class, or do they know that already? Do they know what it is?
If you could give them a quick.
Okay, so normally when workers want to unionize, there's a secret ballot vote, and at a 50% plus one vote to unionize, then you have a union. But one of the problems with the secret ballot elections is that the employer often runs very expensive, elaborate anti-union campaigns and intimidates workers and fires workers and twists the arms of workers to vote against the union. So unions say secret ballot election is just too difficult. We too often lose it because of the union's huge campaign. We'd rather have something called card check, a majority sign up. We'll get a majority of workers to sign cards, and we'll go to the company, we'll go to the employer and say, we have majority of workers supporting a union, please recognize the union. There's no legal obligation for the company to recognize the union based on cards, and the union often says, unless you grant us union recognition, we're going to make your life hell, so you better grant recognition. So there's a tug of war about that. So unions like card check because it often kind of creates a shortcut to get to unionization without all this nasty fighting, with the company firing workers and intimidating workers. So as part of Project 2025, the Heritage Foundation, which wrote Project 2025, it wants to ban, prohibit card check. And I imagine, Professor Honey, that Trump's National Labor Relations Board is going to frown very much on card check and do what it can to limit card check. And yes, many workers, many unions say, let's do card check as a way to do an end run around the National Labor Relations Act. But it still is kind of done within the purview of the act, and employers are always free to reject card check. And if the National Labor Relations Board is what's the word I want? More critical, less welcoming of card check, and it certainly will be under Trump, it's going to be harder. And I mean, as we saw with Starbucks, Starbucks, I was shocked when workers at Amazon and workers at Starbucks unionized, because I've usually thought, and I've written about labor now for like 30 years, that when a company plays super hardball, is the phrase I use against unionization, unions almost never win in a union jive. And both Starbucks and Amazon played super hardball, where they broke the law many, 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 many times. Starbucks fired 150, 200, I lost count of how many pro-union workers. And the National Labor Relations Board and federal judges have ruled time and again that Starbucks illegally fired pro-union workers, and Starbucks closed a dozen stores after they unionized. I mean, it was really being nasty. So yes, Professor Honey, yes, Mike, it's good to have card check, but I think both the Starbucks campaign and the Amazon campaign in Staten Island show that even you could still win nowadays, because there's so much enthusiasm about unions. You could even win against an employer that plays super hardball. But it's hard. It's hard. You got to be good. But the organizers have gotten better. Among young workers, they're just so pro-union nowadays. But as Professor Dreyer said, labor law is still way too weak. When Starbucks fires dozens of pro-union workers, and it's illegal to fire workers in retaliation for supporting a union, under federal law, they can't be fined one penny You can be, if they were fired 2 months ago, you might be required to pay 2 months of back pay, but you're not fined $50,000, $100,000, $200,000 for breaking the law. So there really is this bright green light for companies to break the law. And it would be very good if the labor laws could be reformed so they have some teeth that would discourage, deter employers from, trying this, to break the law, to try to stomp on and crush unions. My voice is going, sorry.
Thanks a lot. Thank you. Thanks
Sure.
for being on the call and doing this.
Thanks,
Yeah.
thanks.
Thanks again. How about one final round of applause for our guest tonight? This was absolutely fantastic. We timed this one out to roughly coincide with the election. I guess when I reached out to you over the summer, I didn't expect to be in quite the mood that I was before this conversation. But honestly, I feel like after these last 90 minutes, I'm feeling a little more optimistic. I mean, a lot of work to be done, but I think there's reason to be sort of, don't give up hope yet.